Politics Live with Joe Coburn.
It's Thursday, the 27th of October. This is Politics Live. Joining me today, Conservative MP Tim Lawton, Labour's Stella Creasy, Professor Nicola Rollock of King's College London and Conservative commentator Albie Amankona. Today, the new Prime Minister faces big problems at the Home Office. Conditions at this processing centre for migrants are criticised.
I spoke to an Afghan family who had been in a marquee for 32 days.
The population of the site is reducing. However, it is very dependent on the numbers coming across the channel.
Meanwhile, the Home Secretary faces further questions about her conduct.
From my own knowledge, there were multiple breaches of the ministerial code.
This is a short history of Rishi Sunak and Brexit.
The Prime Minister says he'll be embracing the opportunities of Brexit, but what does that mean? Also today, is this true?
Britain is a place where people of all races and all beliefs can fulfil their dreams.
Cheer up, Rishi!
And does Rishi Sunak's premiership mean boring is back? Well, let's pick up on that final headline. This is the headline in The Independent. Boring is back, from Michael Gove, who's made a surprise return to the Cabinet as Levelling Up Secretary. He was speaking at the London Club Awards last night and said he was grateful that after 12 months of turbulence, after a rolling news buffet, an all-you-can-eat story extravaganza, that boring is back. Is it, Tim?
I do hope so. I mean, I'm fed up the last couple of years, people coming up saying, oh, gosh, these are really exciting, interesting times we're living in with, you know, one scandal or whatever's going on, to which my response is, well, yes, but I'm really hoping for the boring ones to come back and we can get back to the mainstream of just governing and getting on with the business of what we need to do. We've had razzmatazz, we've had pandemics, we've had wars in Ukraine and everything. Let's just get back to mainstream stuff where the public know what they can expect from their government and the government deliver what the public need them to deliver. If that's boring, I'm all for it.
Proud to be a Conservative, are you, Tim?
I am now, absolutely. It's been a little difficult few weeks, but now I'm really proud again.
Was razzmatazz the name of the club in Aberdeen that Michael Gove was clubbing in?
That's too much information.
Stella, is boring back, and is it a good thing?
I want competency back, because actually for my constituents who are now facing massive increases in their mortgage bills, rents that are rising, are terrified about what's going to happen in the new year, already in heavy levels of debt. They don't care whether the Prime Minister is someone who can tell a good joke. They care whether the Prime Minister is someone who's got a grip. And the trouble is, over the last 24, 48 hours, it's already in question whether that's Rishi Sunak.
Right. Well, you were nodding away to part of that. Nicola, is boring back?
Well, I don't think it's really a question of boring. What we're looking for is stability. But I'm also slightly concerned whether we will get that, given that the new Prime Minister has set out on the steps of Downing Street that tough times lay ahead. So we might be calm in terms of lack of personality, if we can frame it like that. But actually, we have some deep concerns to explore. But let me also say this. We're talking about boring, we're talking about stability, absolutely. But what's missing from this debate is a fundamental understanding of how we reached the situation as we did in the last 6 weeks.
Albie, is boring back?
I think, to just pick up on something which Stella said about competency, I think competency is back. If we just look at the way that the markets have reacted to Rishi Sunak becoming the Prime Minister, the pound is back up to pre-mini budget levels, the cost of borrowing has come down, so much stability in the financial markets, and in fact, the Prime Minister and the Chancellor have been able to delay the mid-term fiscal outlook and upgrade it to a full autumn budget. So it's not about boring being back, it's about competency being back, and the markets agree.
Come on, Albie, that's against Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng. I mean, anybody's going to look more sensible compared to the madness that they inflicted on us. But the damage is still done, and we all know this government is going to bring forward massive cuts that didn't need to happen had we not had this Conservative government in place. So I don't think you can say just because the markets are calmer, because Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are no longer near the controls, that the problems have gone away. We all know difficult things are coming ahead from this government, and they're not being honest about what that's going to mean.
Well, we don't know about cuts. That's why we're going to have a full-scale budget in the autumn to see
you
how
think there
we
won't be
can.
cuts, Tim?
I don't know. I mean, there are various ways of dealing with this problem, and one, first of all, has got to look at it in an international context. This is not something just happening in the United Kingdom.
But do you agree with Stella that it was made worse? The situation was made worse by the past 7 weeks.
The instability and the uncertainty of the mini budget, which was not accompanied by a proper laying out of how the figures add up, was absolutely a mistake. The new Prime Minister said as much yesterday. We are not going there again. But as we've heard from Albie, markets have responded with much more confidence.
Yep.
The pound is back to where it was, above where it was before that budget, and borrowings come down. In the short term, some damage has been done. We've got to rectify that, and we will, and set out the course for the next couple of years.
There is another but, which I think Stella was implying, and that is the reappointment of Suella Braverman. She was Home Secretary. She was forced to resign, and now she's back, despite the fact that she was found to have broken and breached the ministerial code. And the former party chairman, we heard him there, Jake Berry, being interviewed, said actually there have been multiple breaches. Some of your Conservative colleagues are concerned about her, and certainly Yvette Cooper for the Labour Party is raising these concerns as a serious matter. Are you comfortable with Suella Braverman as Home Secretary?
Well, one would expect Yvette Cooper to raise questions. That's her job. I haven't seen exactly what Jake Berry is referring to. It's slightly odd. He makes the comments he has the day after he's just been sacked. I want to see a competent Home Secretary getting on with the really urgent jobs, starting with the channel crossings, which we're going to come on to cross.
And is that person Suella Braverman with question marks?
And I hope it's Suella Braverman, because when she took on the job initially of Home Secretary, she identified that as the top priority. She's got to deliver, and there's got to be transparency. And if there are any underlying questions still there, they need to be cleared up and answered very, very quickly. But the Prime Minister has confidence in her. I trust his judgment. I wanted to get on with the job.
All right, well, let's stick with some of the issues that she has to deal with. I can show you, I think, the front page of the Daily Mail, which says Rishi's migrant crisis headache. These are concerns after evidence that was heard by the Home Affairs Committee yesterday, including by you. You sit on that committee, Tim Lawton. It set out several very serious problems with the asylum system. As we heard in the headlines, issues particularly around the conditions at the asylum processing site at Manston in Kent. This was evidence from David Neal, the Chief Inspector of Borders and Immigration, who visited that site on Monday. It led to an urgent question in the Commons this morning from the Labour MP and chair of that Home Affairs Committee, Diana Johnson. Let's take a listen. When it comes.
The facility was not designed for people to stay there for more than 24 hours. Families are being housed.
Heated, which has air conditioning, which has food, which has medical supplies. Families are prioritised for better accommodation and to have swift opportunities to leave and go and be accommodated within hotels.
Are you satisfied with that answer from Robert Jenrick, Tim?
No, and if you carried on playing the clip, I then asked a question backing up what Diana, as the chair of the committee, had said. And the evidence we heard yesterday from the Inspector of Borders was pretty shocking. Our committee went to visit that facility earlier in the summer, soon after it had been set up.
And was it the same?
No,
did you find the same?
When we went to see it, it had just been set up. It was a big improvement over the marquees they had on the quayside over in Dover, but it was only ever set up as a processing centre for people to go there and be there perhaps 24 hours or perhaps at most 48 hours, not days and weeks, and not for something like 3,000 people.
Right, so you were pretty shocked, I should think, to hear about this. I mean, one of the examples is that a family sleeping on mats in a marquee for over a month.
There's not proper residential accommodation there. It is a temporary processing centre, and the idea is to get people then on to temporary accommodation elsewhere, be it in hotels mostly, and then if they can have their claims processed, then to go on to permanent accommodation. There's an underlying problem as well, which is why the system isn't working. They are taking so long to process people's claims. And the point I made this morning is only 4%, we learned yesterday, all those people who came in 2021 have actually had their claims processed. So everybody else is in limbo, which means there's this logjam in the system, which is why we've got Manston.
I'll come back to you in just a moment. But first of all, Stella, what would be your solution or a solution to this huge backlog? It is 4% of the asylum claims. That's the number that have been processed.
We're spending millions of pounds a day, Suze, and I just want to pick up because Robert Jenrick isn't being honest with Parliament there. I've got a hotel in my constituency which has 400 refugees in it because nobody knows their process because they're still being processed, of which 150 are children. These are children who were brought to that hotel with basically the clothes on their back, no school places, no facilities. They're living cramped in rooms. They've got nowhere to play. There's nowhere for them to be able to cook. And they're being left there for months on end. So the idea that somehow we should be relaxed about Manston because things are getting a bit better and people being moved on to a better place just simply isn't true. This whole system doesn't work. And actually, if you are somebody, even if you're somebody who has little sympathy for people fleeing persecution, you should look at this as incredibly bad value for money for the taxpayer.
Right, well,
so we're spending, say, £5 million a day to do this.
5.6.
5.6, sorry, Tim, I know the details. And as Tim says, processing fewer and fewer people. All the money that's being spent on photo opportunities for Home Secretaries, whichever they are, to stand in the middle of the channel on a boat, could be money spent on actually processing people and recognising who is an asylum seeker and who doesn't have a well-founded claim.
You have painted the picture very clearly, both of you. But what are the solutions? I mean, is it about employing thousands of staff to process asylum claims, Tim?
3 main points quickly. The upstream solution is to make sure they're not coming across the channel in the first place. That's a much bigger issue that involves the
But let's concentrate on the backlog that we're looking at
Secondly, the only practical solution, which is controversial, which hasn't started yet, may never start, but it needs to, is a Rwanda situation where if you come across in a small boat, it is a lottery as to whether you end up, if you have no claim, in a hotel in Kent or on a plane to Rwanda. That will deter people from coming. That's the
And the backlog?
problem.
How do you deal with the backlog of people here?
The downstream problem is they are not processing those claims quickly enough, and they are not able to remove people who are turn out to have no claims, and they are taking years because of the frustration of appeals and going through the court systems, many of which are saying, no, you still don't have a claim to be here. That's why we have these backlogs. And the people who are missing out are those genuine asylum seekers, genuinely fleeing danger in countries overseas which are going through conflict, or people like the Afghan refugees who were lifted here quite legitimately, 12,000 of whom are still in hotels with kids in all those completely inadequate conditions that Stella considers.
All right, there's one.
You cannot mention Rwanda again. I'm sorry, but the Rwanda policy, the idea that solves anything is for the birds, because actually what's happening
is... Well, you don't know, it hasn't happened.
But I do know.
But what I do know as a deterrent, and I'm really keen to look at...
Because I've got a Rwanda case in Walthamstow, and I dread to mention this, because it is so embarrassing as a country that we have a... Nobody knows who's being chosen. I've got a young man who's been threatened with being sent to Rwanda, who travelled with his family who travelled in exactly the same way. They haven't been picked out. And I dread saying that because I don't want the Home Office to pick on the family, because they are a Syrian family who fled Assad. So they are more than likely entitled to asylum here. Nobody knows the criteria.
Rwanda is not Syria.
Nobody knows. Oh, so... But you don't think they have a well-founded fear of persecution, then? Come on, Tim, you're better than this.
One individual family does not mean you could not come up with a scheme that might deter
There is no criteria. There is no criteria, no clarity.
Tim and Stella, hang on. I'm going to bring in our other guests, because as you can see, the solutions are difficult to find. And if we go back to the backlog in the system and why people's claims are not being processed, looking at this, Albie, what do you think the actual problem is here?
Look, the Home Office not being able to process immigration forms, whether or not that's a passport for some of Stella and Tim's constituents or whether or not that is for refugees that have crossed the Channel, is not exactly a new thing. The Home Office has been a dysfunctional department for as long as I have been involved in politics. And perhaps now that we've left the European Union, we've got more control over our migration, perhaps maybe we need to look at actually reforming the Home Office fundamentally, maybe splitting migration out of the Home Office completely. But ultimately, Tim is absolutely right. There are 38,000 people who have crossed the Channel so far this year. And ultimately, what we need to be focusing on is how can we bring those numbers down?
Is that what you would focus on?
I'm convinced by that, actually. And you're right, there's been a backlog for some time, and this is it's a contentious issue. But my understanding is that actually Home Secretaries have not been appearing when called in front of the Home Affairs Select Committee. So if we really are committed, as the new Prime Minister is indicating, to integrity, to accountability, to professionalism, then we must see a situation where Home Secretaries are brought before the Select Committee to give explanation and account of what the current situation is.
We also need to learn from what is working, because one of the questions, Tim, that I think you need to trouble with, and we're going to come to these questions later, is why is it we're not threatening people from Ukraine with being sent to Rwanda, but we are saying that it's acceptable for Syrians or for people from Afghanistan? What we've done with Ukrainians is learn the value of community schemes and community sponsorship and how you can work to integrate people. Because what I'm really concerned about those 150 children is safeguarding. There are children going missing from Manston. Are you comfortable that we are doing everything we can to protect the children who've come to this country free from persecution? In which case, community sponsorship is also a cheaper and more effective way of working.
Well, let Nicola come back and then I'll come to you, Tim.
Just briefly to echo what Stella is saying, actually I think that's a really fundamental issue. We cannot sit and pat ourselves on the back and call ourselves a democracy when we are levelling out fairness and justice unevenly to the most vulnerable in society.
Tim?
The problem is, at the moment, we have a shortage of accommodation. We have a shortage of accommodation for people living here wanting to get their own independence. We have cramped accommodation. Stella and I have cases every day of the week from our own constituents about that. We then had a surge.
My constituents too now.
We then have a surge of people coming across the Channel. The worst possible way to come into this country, whatever you think about their claims for asylum or not, on top of the 12,000 that we are here absolutely legitimately, we're trying to house permanently from Afghanistan, on top of the 24,000 we've had from Syria, on top of the many more coming in from Hong Kong, there is just a shortage. So people coming across the Channel, including 12,000 Albanians. Albania is not a war zone. It is not a human rights abuser. It's a candidate country to join the EU. They are jumping the queue for people who legitimately need safety and support and help in this country. That is what is wrong.
But is one of
we've got to be tougher and they've got to be removed much sooner.
Well, is one of the solutions, though, there is one of the solutions to expand what the government calls safe and legal routes. If you look at the figures here, resettled refugees, and these are refugees that come via the very official channel of the United Nations, we do very well, 24,700 compared to Sweden at 20,900. But if you have a look, Tim, at the figures for refugees resettled and granted asylum, we are much further down the table compared to a country like Germany. It comes back to these asylum claims being processed efficiently. Hence the backlog, hence it's exacerbated by people coming across in those small boats. We don't yet know whether Rwanda might or might not work because it's never actually been put into place. Is there a problem, which I think Labour governments had a problem with too pre-2010, and that is returning failed asylum seekers or people who do try and get their asylum process claimed, it's rejected, but they stay?
I think we all recognise, actually, across the political divide, and I agree with Albie, actually, there's a case for fundamental reform because in Parliament there's a divide between people who are on left and right and also people who have to deal with the UKBA on a daily basis and people who don't. But it is worth recognising how much processing makes a difference. Absolutely, there is an issue with Albania and gangs. 50% of those people from Albania who have been processed have been found to have a well-founded claim because a lot of them are being trafficked. I mean, there's an issue with people smuggling there.
How many have been processed? 4%. It's 50% or 4%.
No, it's not actually. This is before you get to your 4% figure because this is over the course of the whole of the people applying. That's on the immigration statistics. I looked it up this morning.
The big Albanian numbers have come in this year and they're not being processed.
You and I actually share more in common about this because we both recognise that probably some kind of safe and legal passage system that is better at processing people so that absolutely...
Well, it exists. It's whether they should be expanded.
Well, no, it doesn't exist because that's why you've got thousands of people still stuck on our border. I mean, people forget we signed a deal for the border in Calais. None of this is working. You don't have to be somebody who is proud of Britain's record in refugees, which frankly, as Nicola says, is questionable, to think that there is a better way of doing it. The government's obsession with looking like they're being tough on immigration, only certain immigrants, as we know, is costing us millions of pounds.
Illegal immigrants, they're being tough on
How do you know they're illegal? How do you know they're illegal?
The 38,000 people.
Not illegal.
The 38,000 people who are crossing the Channel in boats.
Hang on, Stella, let other people speak.
illegally. And actually, look, I actually agree with you. I do think we should be opening up more safe and legal routes. But I also agree with Tim in that I do think a strong deterrent in the form of Rwanda is also reasonable, even if we have those safe and legal routes open, because ultimately the people traffickers will still want to make their money and they'll still be trafficking in human misery. So there's got to be, I always say, Rwanda and. It can't just stop at Rwanda. We do have to open up these more broad-based safe and legal routes and cooperate better with
I'm going to finish it there because we're going to turn to Northern
Ireland. No, we're going to claim asylum. It's not illegal to claim asylum.
No,
it's not illegal to claim asylum, Albie. These are people fleeing persecution. You don't know otherwise until you process them.
All right, we are going to leave it there. We'll spend the whole programme talking about it. We're going to turn to Northern Ireland. We'll have a special programme then just for you, where there is a deadline at midnight tonight to restore the power-sharing executive or face new elections. Let's talk to our correspondent at Stormont, Chris Page. What's likely to happen, Chris?
Well, yes, we're now, as you say, Joe, 12 hours, within 12 hours of the deadline for the Welsh Government to be restored. That deadline was really put in place as soon as the last Assembly election had happened back in May. And now it looks very much like we're heading towards another election to the Stormont Assembly, probably to be held on the 15th of December. At the moment, politicians are actually back inside the Assembly chamber. There hasn't been a substantive sitting since those elections earlier this year, but a special recall petition was put together by the largest party, Sinn Féin, and the Cross Community Alliance Party, and they wanted a debate to be held on the cost of living. However, the first item on the agenda is the election of a speaker. Without a speaker, there can't be a debate. The DUP has made it clear that it will continue to veto the election of a speaker. So the DUP's Paul Givan, on his feet in the Assembly chamber a few minutes ago, said that as far as the DUP was concerned, it had a mandate from its voters that it got from the election back in May to continue to block the operation of the power-sharing institutions as long as the Brexit trade border with the UK has remained in place. And that trade border, known as the Northern Ireland Protocol, is still there. Therefore, it will be sticking to its position. So I expect over the next half hour the politicians will go through the motions, if you like, of casting their votes for and against the Speaker. But even if a majority of Assembly members vote for a Speaker, and that probably will happen, the DUP, as the largest unionist party, has a veto. So it intends to vote against the election of a Speaker. That means no further business, no debate on the cost of living, no ministers appointed, and it is all but inevitable that that deadline will come and go at midnight with no restoration of power sharing. The Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, has indicated he is going to call another election tomorrow.
Right, so that is looking the most likely, isn't it, Chris? We're watching pictures of the sitting actually taking place while you're talking.
Yes, that is going to be really the way this particular sitting of the Assembly turns out. There's an element really of political theatre, some would say, electioneering, others might say about this. Certainly the speeches that we've already heard in the Assembly chamber have had an air of an election campaign about them. As I've already referenced what the DUP had to say, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin, who is in line to be the First Minister as leader of the largest party as things stand, she accused the DUP of being in a standoff with the public, and she said people would look on bewildered, wondering why they were continuing to go to do their jobs, and in their eyes politicians weren't really at work. The leader of the Cross Community Alliance Party, Naomi Long, said that the whole problem was the way the institutions operated, that they needed to be reformed so that, for example, one party, the DUP, couldn't have the power on its own to stop the political institutions from operating at all. And that may well come into the debate down the line, probably after an election, if we get a similar picture in that election to what we got in May, where Sinn Féin won the most seats for the first time, replacing the DUP as the largest party. But there was also a surge in support for the Alliance Party. They moved from 5th place into 3rd, more than doubling their seats. That party that designates as neither unionist nor nationalist. I think it's fair to say there's very little public enthusiasm indeed for an election. Indeed, none of the parties particularly want it either. For starters, they've got to finance another election campaign.
All right, Chris Page, busy behind you, the traffic going in and out there. Thank you very much joining us there from Stormont. Now, those who were watching the programme yesterday will remember that I promised we would be talking about Rishi Sunak and Brexit, but the conversation around the reshuffle expanded and we ran out of time, so we're going to look at that issue today now. And this is from Rishi Sunak's campaign to be leader earlier in the summer. Have a look.
This is a short history of Rishi Sunak and Brexit. When Rishi became Chancellor in 2020, he delivered several Brexit wins, including free ports, an idea he had first pursued in 2016, and alcohol reform, to name just two. So there you have it, Rishi Sunak, a real Brexiteer from day one.
And that was a campaign video, just so people are clear. Rishi Sunak emphasising his Brexit credentials. He raised the issue of Brexit opportunities again in his speech in Downing Street. What are they exactly, these Brexit opportunities? You have been a fervent Brexiteer right from the beginning. Do tell us.
So you've dumped this issue on us because you couldn't get round to talk about it. Thanks so much. As if we hadn't spoken about Brexit for years and years and years.
I thought it was one of your favourite subjects.
I would talk for the whole programme on Brexit, and it's not helped that we've had a pandemic and now Ukraine to actually get to grips with those freedoms which the referendum brought about. So it is about the trade deals which are starting to come through, the fact that we can do those. It's about the scientific research and vaccine which we can commission, not be controlled by the EU. It's about we don't have to go along with a ridiculous EU energy policy because energy security just hasn't featured there. It's about UK companies which don't even export to European countries, don't have to follow all the regulations that wouldn't apply necessarily in this country. It's about having environment regulations. We've had the toughest Environment Act ever.
All right,
and all those considerations.
We'll talk about the regulation.
Animal welfare, be it on farmers being able to choose to grow those foods which are most
Tim, as you know, a lot of people will see that as removing those regulations and those environmental standards. More broadly on your issue on trade, I mean, the latest Office for Budget Responsibility analysis of the effects of Brexit suggested that the trade and cooperation agreement with the EU would reduce long-run productivity by 4% relative to remaining in the EU. The trade deals that have been done thus far don't come close to that. Do you accept it?
Because we've only just started, for goodness sake.
Well, we left the EU in 2016.
Yes, and then what negotiations were able to go on during a pandemic and now during Ukraine? We have a few additional trade deals. We have rolled over more than 70 trade deals that we had within the EU. We're continuing with India, the fifth largest economy in the world. We have several trade deals with individual US states, which are their economies are larger than whole countries as well.
Stella's laughing. Why are you laughing? Labour wants to make the most of Brexit and make Brexit opportunities work.
And I say this as somebody who is both the chair of the Labour Movement for Europe and very clear that this is not about rejoining the EU. But we have to be honest with the public. There's only problems caused by Brexit and then the question of how quickly you can fix them. Exporting is down by 1/3, Tim. You can have all the individual trade deals you want with individual American states. You're not going to get a deal with America anytime soon, which is actually the only thing that could compensate for losing the access and all the friction and all the extra paperwork. And everybody's constituents are telling them about this. I can't believe you haven't had businesses talking to you about all the extra paperwork that comes as a result of Brexit that means that they are just giving up on exporting to our nearest neighbours.
Sure. They are not
businesses.
Well, hang on, let him answer.
Making it easier for us. Of course, they're not going to make it easier for us. They're still very sore that we've lost, that they've lost us. There are businesses who have opportunities outside of Europe. That's the problem, Stella. I'm afraid your party and the Remainers have seen the world revolves only around the EU. The rest of the world is where the opportunities lie, and those were opportunities we could not seek and exploit when we were part of EU, which meant we could not negotiate our own trade deals. There is lots more. Well, it's entirely true. There's lots more to come.
It's my turn, because the deal we've done with Japan, we could have done whilst we were in the European Union. Actually, what most of us are concerned about are basic things like geography and sanity. 500 million people as a trading bloc is a good market for our constituents' businesses.
And will continue to be.
Now, Brexit has happened. I am not sitting here talking about reversing Brexit, but I do think there needs to be some honesty.
In your heart of hearts, do you not feel that actually, from your perspective, rejoining the single market would be a good idea?
Listen, I think that nationalisation in the 1980s of lots of our major industries has caused us all sorts of problems. But I recognise now that dealing with those problems isn't immediately about just saying, let's spend more money on... privatisation, yes. You're absolutely right. That's why I propose mutualisation. We are where we are. And what I'm more concerned about is that people like Tim want to fight the battles of 2016 to avoid the scrutiny about the madness of the EU Retain Law Bill that's just come into Parliament, which will do further damage. I mean, we've already got an economy in all sorts of damage, and you are about to rip up 2,500 pieces of legislation, which business groups, all sorts of environmental groups are up in arms about, with no guarantee about what comes next. If you want to talk to businesses who are struggling...
A lot of people see the opportunities and now want to seize those opportunities.
Hang on. Well, I want to know what the opportunities are. What do you say to someone like Guy Hands, private equity boss, former Tory party supporter? He said this on Monday.
I think if the Tory party can own up to the mistake they made and how they negotiated Brexit and have somebody leading it who actually has the intellectual capability and the authority to renegotiate Brexit, there is a possibility of turning around the economy. But without that, the economy is frankly doomed.
Tim?
Well, Guy Hands didn't vote for Brexit.
No, well, I think...
There's been a long-term critic of Brexit.
But he's saying this now.
I don't agree with him.
Right, he's saying this now. What are the opportunities, do you think, the tangible opportunities, Albie, that can be grasped by Rishi Sunak? He talked about alcohol reform, he's talked about free ports. But what are the other, perhaps more transformative opportunities that he's referring to?
Well, I think for Greg, obviously being a finance man, you mentioned that he was in private equity. Of course, there are lots of financial service regulatory reforms that we could be passing now that we've left the European Union. You know, looking at reforms to MiFID II, looking at Solvency II. I know the removal of the cap on bankers' bonuses wasn't very popular, but ultimately that was a populist reaction to the financial crash of 2008. And now we're no longer in the European Union. We can get rid of pointless regulations like that, which are actually stifling
OK, you've mentioned some of the financial regulations, some of the city restrictions, which, yes, you're absolutely right, the city doesn't like. But what are the other regulations and things that are blocking progress here that need to be removed?
So if we look at the GDPR regulations which are imposed on small businesses, there are some small businesses that are spending up to 80 hours a week just to be GDPR compliant. If we look at other things in clinical trials, for example, where that is holding up important work in the pharmaceutical industry, there are lots of opportunities of Brexit, but we've just got to be bold enough to grasp them and actually grasp them in a way which is reasonable. And I do actually feel, with Rishi Sunak as the Prime Minister, we will actually be able to do that.
Nicola, watching all this since 2016, but actually perhaps since 2019 more specifically, what do you make of it?
Well, I think the Conservatives have got themselves into a little bit of a tight spot, if I may, insofar as actually the reasons we went into the 2016 referendum was because of discomforts within the Conservative Party under Cameron. So the policies and the implications, the ramifications around getting a yes were not fully thought through. And so what we're doing today is trying to squash a circle into a square space.
Tim, do you agree with that?
Well, it was the public who voted for Brexit in 2016, whatever the situation within the Conservative Party. And many of us went out of our way, spent several years travelling around Europe, speaking to politicians to get a reform package which would have allowed us to stay within the EU and to settle that argument, I hope, once and for all. Right. Cameron completely blew it. They didn't agree, so the referendum was the only option. That's where it came from. All right. And now there are opportunities that we need to make the most of.
Let's talk about something else, because Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, celebrated Rishi Sunak's appointment as the first British Asian Prime Minister yesterday at PMQ'S. Let's listen to what he said.
The first British Asian Prime Minister is a significant moment in our national story. And it's a reminder that for all the challenges we face as a country, Britain is a place where people of all races and all beliefs can fulfil their dreams.
Do you agree, Stella?
I absolutely think things are changing, but I do think that if you are from a minority community background, your opportunities are less than your opportunities those from white backgrounds. I'm very struck by the research by the new Black Equality Organisation, which has shown that 2/3 of young black people feel that public services directly discriminate against them. And I think the evidence we have is that is a well-founded fear. If I look at things like the evidence of black women in our maternity systems who are 5 times more likely to have a negative experience giving birth, there are clearly challenges there. Black children in our schools who experience direct discrimination, adultification. I've had cases in my own local constituency. And I think one of the challenges for us is undoubtedly Rishi Sunak's appointment as Prime Minister is a landmark moment, and we should celebrate that. But it also reminds us how much further we have to go. My worry is that conversation isn't happening in the mainstream, and we would all be better off if it was.
You've written a book, you've got it here, The Racial Code, Nicola. It discusses everyday racism and microaggressions, some of the things, actually, that we just heard from Stella. Is there a massive gulf between the experiences that you have documented in your book and the appointment of the first British Asian Prime Minister?
So look, I think, of course, we have to recognise that this is a historic moment, the first British Asian Prime Minister. But the rhetoric, and let me put a very firm full stop after that sentence, but we also have to look at the rhetoric across the media and across social media in the last few days. And the rhetoric has very much been one of we live in a meritocracy. If this individual can make it, then anyone can make it. And I think that's profoundly problematic. That's my first point. Because
Why do you think it's profoundly problematic?
Because we don't live in a meritocracy. And as Stella's just pointed out, a series of data that show that we have inconsistencies in terms of outcomes for different ethnic minority groups. Now, let me be clear, and these are some of the issues I explore in the book, but let me be clear, not all of those inequalities are due to, say, racism, but we don't have mature debates about this subject in a transparent way. And there is a second point. And the second point is about nuance, and this is what I am attempting to do in my book, is that actually we've been really selective about the way that we are recognising Rishi Sunak's ethnicity. And so let me just explain what I mean by that. At the point at which he's made Prime Minister, we jump up in celebration of his ethnicity and his faith. But if we rewind slightly and hold on to that same lens, so we're looking at his ethnicity, looking at his faith, actually what we saw in the Conservative leadership contest was that someone who's qualified, experienced, and had a significant role, obviously the Chancellor of the Exchequer, lost out to someone who is a white woman and lacking in qualifications and experience.
First of all, the reason why Liz Truss won the Conservative leadership election isn't because she's white, it's because she was selling the Conservative Party fairy tales about tax cuts and being able to borrow and there being no problem whatsoever, and that has been roundly disproved as a complete disaster. So I just want to address that point first. Second, the second point I will make is about the media coverage. Now, actually, some of the media coverage that I was seeing from left-wing newspapers like The Guardian and The Independent were actually talking about it in a similar way to how Rupert Huck was talking about it at Labour Party conference a couple of weeks ago, about it not being a true win for diversity because he's not actually properly Asian because he's a wealthy man who went to a private independent school. And actually, I think one of the things which is really important when we're talking about race relations is that we don't just lump all people of colour into that people of colour band.
Absolutely.
If we actually look at employment and educational outcomes, British Asians outperform white British people.
Well, no, let me
it's actually
accurate.
It's actually, can I just finish my point and then please do rebut it if I am wrong? It's actually, and if we look at the communities that do need the most help, we're looking at people like the British Caribbean community. So I think looking at things through this lens of white people have all of the privilege and people of colour are reliant on people's goodwill and don't have any privilege whatsoever and can't make it in this country is wrong. And I think Rishi Sunak does actually show that you can make it in this country regardless of what your race is.
So let me be absolutely clear. I did not say that, you know, a white woman made it because of her privilege. That's not the point I was making.
But that's essentially
I was making a slightly more nuanced point. And my point is that if we're going to look at and celebrate Rishi Sunak as the first British Asian Prime Minister, we also have to look at the full picture. This is not Woolworths pick and mix. We can't just take the bits of the racial dynamic that we're interested in and make us feel good and ignore what happened prior to that. And to your point about disaggregating groups. I completely agree with you. Of course you must disaggregate groups. But you've just talked about British Asians doing well, so falling into your own trap. We actually know when we look educationally that British Indians tend to do well as compared to, say, Pakistanis and Bangladeshis. So again, my point is about nuance. My point is about having a mature debate about these issues.
Tim, you've listened to the debate here between these two. When you look at Rishi Sunak, it is a huge symbol of the diversity that you heard Keir Starmer talk about. But does it really represent the experience of everyday things that happen to people from ethnic minorities? Does it immediately lead to improvements in outcomes for people who come from ethnic minority backgrounds?
I think it sends an important message and it sets an important example. And the experience across the whole of society is very mixed. And I think we need to, you know, the study that Nicola was part of into the Metropolitan Police and whether there is inherent racism there. There are some serious problems there. There are various groups of people from ethnic minorities who are excelling. But there are those who are absolutely left behind in health outcomes. We've just had Baby Loss Awareness Week, stillbirths, which is something I've done a lot with, impacts onto ethnic minority women far higher than others. So it's a really mixed picture. But it wasn't just about Rishi Sunak. So Rishi Sunak as our first British Asian Prime Minister, great. But what I'm far more excited by is actually he's really rather good. He's really competent, he's impressive, and he's been successful. And I think he's going to bring those skills to bear on running the country. If you look at the lineup for the first leadership contest we had, out of those 8 candidates in the Conservative Party, 4 of those candidates were from ethnic minorities and 4 were from women, and nobody butted, 4 were women. Nobody butted an eyelid, because actually we've got over that in the Conservative Party. We can produce that sort of talent. They might happen to be black, or they might happen to be women. So what? The Labour Party could never produce 8 candidates with that degree of skill, competence and diversity.
Well, I must let Stella answer that, and then I'll come back to you.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear who they are.
The way you're talking about it reveals how much further we have to go, because everyone's desperate to put somebody in a box rather than recognise the layers and what people might call the intersectionality of the challenge that we face here. It is perfectly possible, and you know, women have experienced this. The idea that once you've got one woman, the whole problem's fixed. People saying, well, we had Margaret Thatcher, so somehow we don't have gender inequality. What Rishi Sunak represents is how much further we have to go. That's why it's important, for example, that we bring in ethnicity pay gap reporting, because that's something everyone agreed should happen and still hasn't happened, to recognise that having 1 or 2 people at the top does not reflect fundamental transformation within the system.
I agree.
It simply shows that there is a road that could be travelled. The challenge here is that obviously Rishi Sunak had a huge amount of financial resource, and one of the things that I'm very cognizant, representing the 9th highest level of child poverty in the country, is that the diversity within that adds layers to the barriers and challenges that those children face. It doesn't deny it.
We haven't got that long left. And Nicola, what I want to ask you is about the everyday racism. What does that actually look like? I mean, how does it feel every day to be slighted in the way that you have, to some extent, documented in that book?
Well, what it looks like, and if I might include in my response comments back to Tim, it looks like being slighted or missed for a position for which you're more than qualified for someone who isn't qualified. And what I'm seeking to do in the book is to move beyond, acknowledge, of course, there are overt forms of racism which we're familiar with. And I think everyone obviously will be familiar with the racist murder of George Floyd back in 2020. What I'm interested in exploring in the racial code is I use non-fiction, so I draw on reports, on statistics, government data, but I craft stories around some of the key themes to emerge from that, to talk about people's everyday experiences. And so if I use George Floyd, if I may, what we might consider is that Derek Chauvin didn't become racist at that moment, that there were probably behaviours and assumptions and treatments of people of colour, and that's what I mean by everyday forms of racism, so more subtle forms of racism.
You founded Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. We haven't got very long left. Do you agree with that that's where the focus should be, on this everyday instances or experiences of racism?
I think the focus should be on the practical policies that governments can bring in to help close racial disparities in this country. And I hope we'll hear something from the new Equalities Minister, Kemi Badenoch, on the Inclusive Britain strategy soon.
thank you, and thank you to all of my guests for today. I will be back tomorrow with Politics UK at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.
For some strange reason, the quality dropped. You can tell. I don't know why it did it, and I couldn't be asked stopping it and replaying it. Maybe because it's live. It was literally still live when I was playing it. And then the stream just dropped. That's not my quality, by the way. That was the BBC stream. Literally went down for some fucking odd reason. Don't know why. Anywho. I was saying, oh yeah, Politics UK. I don't know, they never used to do it on a Friday. Now they changed it to like Fridays as well. They used to just stop today. You wouldn't get any politics on a Friday. Anywho. Question time, hopefully tonight. You know, last week I was going to do question time. Could I find question time on the actual BBC iPlayer? No. I had to go digging for it. It was like, it wasn't actually in the list of programs, even though it was literally on. They hid it somewhere. Don't know why. But I had to go and find it. I watched it. It was actually a good question time. But I'm going to be asked to upload it. So hopefully, they'll have it on the fucking thing tonight. Or at least know where to find it anyway. So, question time will be on tonight. I'll stream it tonight, I think. Anywho, hope you enjoy the rest of your day and all that good jazz. And I'll see you tomorrow. Oh, well, tonight, I should say.